In this devotional, I'm going to share with you 3 thoughts from Romans 13, verses 1 through 7, where I'll ask the question, should I obey the authorities? Romans 13, verses 1 through 7 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." One of the problems that existed in the early church and even exists to today is how should Christians respond to governing authorities? And it's a question that's significant because very often the governing authorities will be used by the enemies of God to attack his people. So we might be asking ourselves the question, do I really need to obey the governing authorities when the enemies of Christ are using them as a weapon against me? Well, Paul actually speaks to that here in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Thought number 1, authority. We need to recognize that all authority that exists on earth comes from God. All authority. Every system of authority that exists is rooted and based upon God's ultimate authority over creation. So all authority in heaven and on earth is rooted in God's authority over his creation. And that's significant. It's significant because it means that any authority, whether they are acting in a way that we like or in a way that we don't like, has on loan from God their authority. So, if we recognize that all authority is rooted in the Lord's ultimate authority over creation, then we recognize that if there is an authority placed over us, our default position will be obedience. Thought number 2, good conduct. Paul makes this argument. It's a pretty simple one. If you are conducting yourself well, if you are exercising good conduct, then the authorities are not going to be a problem for you. If you are behaving in the way that you ought to behave as a believer, then the authorities won't be an issue. Now, here's the crazy part. Paul himself has numerous issues with authorities. He is constantly getting himself into trouble. He's getting thrown out of cities. He's getting beaten. He's getting arrested. He ultimately dies at the hands of the authorities. But what Paul always does is recognize their authority. What Paul is continually doing is performing good conduct, and it's in spite of his good conduct that he's ultimately arrested. In fact, oftentimes it's because of his good conduct that he is arrested and he has to suffer at the hands of the authorities. But what we need to know is that our responsibility as Christians is to lead lives of good conduct. And in the majority of cases, as we do that, as we lead lives of good conduct, then the authorities are not going to be an issue for us. Will there be exceptions to that? Sure. But that doesn't take away our responsibility to behave in a godly manner, regardless of the circumstances. Thought number 3, what is owed? Ultimately, what Paul says here is that you need to give to those what is owed. So if you owe something, you need to give it to them. And it doesn't matter if it's taxes, because if you think there's problems with taxes now, that's something that's a universal. People always have to pay taxes, and they never like to do it. What does Paul say? He says, if you owe taxes, you need to pay the taxes. Because after all, those who are collecting the taxes are the stewards of God's authority on earth. And the Lord has given them the authority to collect up those taxes. But he doesn't limit it to that. But if it's honor that's owed, you need to render honor. If it's respect that is owed, you need to render that respect. And this is something that is embedded in Paul and his ministry, where he acknowledges the authorities that are over him and conducts himself in the best way that he can, because ultimately he is trying to communicate the beauties of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he won't be able to do that well if he is constantly in trouble because of his relationship with the authorities in the world. These three thoughts come from the assigned reading of Romans chapters 13 and 14. If you'd like to read through the Bible with me, you can do so by subscribing to this channel, by clicking on the link in the description, or by joining the Facebook group Through the Bible, where we are reading the text of Scripture together.